Ah, the Ender 3. If you're into hobby 3D printing, I know that you've heard about the Creality Ender 3. It's probably the best, most affordable entry-level 3D printer out there. And it does turn out a pretty nice 3D print right out of the box. But there's one main reason why you might want to look at buying an Ender 3. And that is the price tag. I got this Ender 3 shipped to my door for $153.48 US, and it arrived in 7 days from a US warehouse. And at that price tag, the Ender 3 is going to be really hard to beat. It's probably the best bang for the buck 3D printer right now, and it has been for some time. Even if you just wanted to give 3D printing as a hobby a try, you're not going to be out a lot of money here. Now, we have talked about content on YouTube on Ender 3s already, and there's a lot of great stuff out there. But I wanted to do something just a little bit different. I wanted to make a series of videos that follows the path of some 3D printing users. Most of the time, you're going to get it out of the box, get it set up, and get it printing, and the Ender 3 will probably be printing pretty well at that point. But then you realize that you can 3D print parts for this 3D printer on this 3D printer that make it even better. Then maybe you move to purchasing some modifications, like a main board or a print surface. We don't want to get too crazy on the budget on a machine like this, but I think there's a lot of mods that you can make for little to no money that can make your experience a lot better. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start with this video, get it out of the box, get it set up. I'll show you some of the things that I would do when setting up a printer like this, and we're just going to use the things that are in this box. Nothing modified at this time. We'll move on to that later. So let's start, let's get the box open and see what we got. And as we build this 3D printer, it's important to note that these machines change a lot over time. The machine that I'm building here in September 2019 might not be the same as the one you built last year or the one you build next week, but it should be pretty similar, and this should be a good guide going forward. The Ender 3s are usually packed fairly well, and it should be assembled in pretty much one main piece for the Y, and then you assemble the X, the overhead gantry, and you put a few other parts on. They're not real complicated to assemble. You have a one-page sheet for your assembly instructions, pretty straightforward. Over here we have our LCD screen. We have our X and top extrusion, it's 2020. We have our Z bracket and extruder assembly. And then you can just lift the whole Y carriage out here. It's pretty much assembled already. Looks like we lost a bed wheel during shipping. That shouldn't be a big deal. And then over here we have our power supply. First thing you want to do is check to make sure it's set to the right voltage. Mine is set to 230. I need to flip it over to 115. Done. And right out of the box, go ahead and check this XT60 connector. In the past, they've used some of these that probably weren't that high quality, and they had a tendency to burn up. This one is name brand, and it is soldered correctly. It looks good. Then on level 2, we have our vertical extrusion, 2040, our power cord, spool holder, Z motor, our tools and our screws, a scraper, spool holder shaft, the other X bracket for the right side, some sample filament, the X idler, some Bowden couplers and extra collet clips, and an extra nozzle. Our Z end stop is in there as well, and our SD card reader. First thing we'll do is unwrap our 2020 extrusions for the two uprights. Your Z screw is going to be inside here for protection. We'll just remove that. And from the front of the printer, the front is where the fan and the SD card slots are. Your power supply is going to be over here on the right, and your Z motor is going to be over here on the left. With these extrusions, the one with the two holes at the bottom, that's going to be the one over here on the left, and the one with the two holes further apart, that's going to hold your power supply. It's going to be over here on the right. For the one for the power supply, the holes have been countersunk a bit, so they make room for the screw heads. You want those facing the front of the printer, so it'll go just like this. And from the bottom of the printer, we'll use our 5x45 screws. We'll just stick them through the bottom here, and then they thread into the bottom of the extrusion. So again, the left one that goes on the Z lead screw side goes right here. The two smaller holes go down. There's no need to tighten these up completely yet. We'll come back through and get everything snug after everything's been leveled. Then we'll flip it over and move to the other side. Remember, we want the countersunk portion to be towards the front, and we want the holes to be towards the bed, so the inside of the printer. It goes just like this. Same thing to 5mm by 45mm screws. Just get them kind of tight for now. And with our two uprights on, we'll go ahead and spin it back around so we're back to the front of the printer right here. The power supply will go on. It goes on the back of this upright. It sets just like this. And we use two M4 by 20mm screws to go through the extrusion into the threaded hole on the power supply. You can go ahead and tighten both of these up. You can see from this side that the power supply cover is going to be off the extrusion just a little bit to have room for the wires. And then right here is where we'll attach our LCD screen bracket. And go ahead and remove our film. And it attaches just like this right here. It threads into these holes in the extrusion. Just two of them. This is a cap head screw. It's an M5 by 8mm screw. And our screen is on. Then we'll flip around to the other side and we'll install our Z end stop. It goes right here. The switch is mounted on a plastic part already, and it usually already has the screws with the T-nuts on them. They just slide into this extrusion. And for now, we're just going to put it on this extrusion, and we'll adjust it here in a moment. But just back out those screws slightly, and then tighten them down and make sure that T-nut gets flipped around horizontal in the slot. You don't want it to stay vertical. It has to flip around and grip inside that extrusion. So we can just leave it there for now. On the back of this same extrusion is where our Z motor is going to go. It'll set in here just like this, and it mounts with a couple of screws that go through those two bottom holes on the frame. This one attaches with two M4 by 18 countersunk screws. I have seen these where they use T-nuts instead, but I think they line up a little better now that they have threaded holes in the extrusion for these to go into. So you can just slide these into the plastic mount and just thread them into the holes that are in the extrusion. The motor is pretty much going to set right on this extrusion rail. You can go ahead and snug these two up for now. These two being countersunk should make it pretty straight. We might need to adjust it a little bit after we put the Z-rod in, but we'll check that in a minute. You can go ahead and put your Z-rod in the coupler, and then we'll move to assembling the X-axis. So we have our X motor and extruder assembly, and we need one of the pieces of our 2020 extrusion. The one with two holes on either end that are countersunk. This one goes on the top of the frame. You need the opposite one. It has about 6 holes in it. We'll take two of our M4 by 16 cap head screws. The X motor and extruder assembly go like this towards the front of the printer. And the extrusion with the countersunk hole with the two holes that are closer together, this fits over this screw right here. These two holes line up with these two holes in this mount. So it fits just like this. And then from the back side, we put our M4 by 18 button head screws. From the back of the mount, you can just go through the hole that's in the other side of this plate and get at those screws with your wrench. Once both of those are in, having both of them in should make sure it's fairly well aligned. Then you can go ahead and snug those two up. And while we're working on this portion, one thing that I've seen in the past on these kits, this bracket won't be perfectly 90 degrees, and it'll cause the Z-rod to bind. So make sure that this bracket isn't bent at all. It has to be really straight in order for this to work. Also, make sure your Z-nut is snugged up. A lot of people will loosen this up to keep it from binding, but that's not the path you want to take. You want it to be nice and flat, and you want the bracket to be nice and flat. Good or bad, the metal is somewhat workable. You can get this in a vise and level it out. I have done it before. Just make sure it's okay on your kit. We can also go ahead and put our Bowden coupler on the extruder assembly right here. It doesn't have to be super tight, but they do give you a wrench. The next thing we're going to want to do is slide on our hot end assembly. Now it is going to be connected to the body of the printer with the wires. Just make sure the wires are running out the front and they're not tangled with anything before you put it on, because that can cause you some headaches later. Ultimately, we're going to want those wires to run from the back over here, so just make sure it's clear of the bed and the other wire loom. So our hot end carriage will slide on just like this. Your hot end fan is facing front. Again, the front is where the end stop switch and this QR code is, so it goes on just like that. And the other side of the X carriage, the wheels that will go on the other vertical extrusion, will go on the back of this assembly. So you'll have this countersunk spot. That allows for this screw head right here. It fits just like this. And from the back, we'll have two more of our M4x16 cap head screws. And once you've got both of those in, again, you can go ahead and snug them down. Those holes should keep it pretty lined up. And from the front, we can go ahead and put on our X belt. It does have these brass ends on it. It's pre-cut. It goes in this channel right here, so we can just kind of sneak it underneath our hot end carriage. We'll go over the top of the X motor pulley inside this plastic box here. Just fish it out the side. We'll pull it through, and then underneath the bottom of that gear, under the X extrusion, we'll pull it down under there, and then back underneath, again in the extrusion, and it goes right in this slot on the hot end carriage. When you slide this in, make sure this brass piece is as close to this metal as possible so it doesn't move when you're tightening it. And to the other side of the hot end carriage, we're going to do the same thing. Come underneath, slide that belt in the slot on the other side. Same thing on that brass piece, just get it down there as close as you can. We're going to tighten it up next. So back to the front, we have our X tensioner already assembled. Make sure there's no slop on this bolt, on those bearings. It should be snugged up, but they should spin freely. And it already comes assembled with some screws with T-nuts. It fits on right here. So the belt will go over it, like so. Then you can back these screws out a bit so those T-nuts start to spin freely. And you don't want to get the belt too tight. Having it too tight can be just as bad as being too loose. But I do like to get the Allen wrench in here and put just a little bit of pressure on that idler when I'm tightening up these T-nuts. So I'll stick it in just like this, and we'll snug up these bolts just a bit. Make sure that T-nut spins around correctly. And we'll put just a bit of tension on this wrench to tension that belt, and we'll tighten these two down. Not too tight, not too loose. Now we can take the whole X gantry that we built, and the wheels will slide on the extrusion, and then that Z-rod is going to go in this brass nut right here. So it sits on there just like this. It's actually resting on the top of that Z-rod. If we take a look from the back, our Z-rod goes right in this brass nut, and we can just screw it down a bit. It might be a little tough to start it, but it should go down pretty smooth. And then we can go ahead and put our top extrusion section. It goes just like this. You use your M5x25 screws through the top. Again, no need to get these super tight right now. We're going to go through a leveling phase here in just a minute. They give you two of these plastic caps. They go on the ends of the extrusion up here on top. One on that side. And I'm going to leave the spool holder off for now, but let's go ahead and wire it up. So let's start at the front and work our way around. This is the ribbon cable for the LCD screen. You want this to go in EXP3. If you take a look underneath the LCD, it's the plug that you can't see back here under the extrusion. It's the one closest to the bed. The key on the cable's on the top. It goes to the top of the screen, just like so. Then we'll spin around to the power supply. We'll hook up our XT60 connector right here with the one coming from the main board. Just plugs in just like that. Your Y in-stop and Y motor should already be plugged in, but you can check those connections just to make sure they're good. Then to the Z motor connection, you're going to have a wire labeled Z. It plugs in just like that. Then the Z in-stop, you'll have a 3-pin cable that's labeled Z. It goes right in here, like so. Then we'll move up to our X motor and our extruder. You'll have a ribbon cable with 2 motor plugs and an in-stop wire, the 3-pin. The 3-pin goes right here inside this X gear case. I like to route mine up from the bottom, like so. And then one of these will be labeled X. That plugs in right down here. And the other is labeled E. You'll probably have to separate that wire loom just a bit, but it'll go right here on your extruder motor. It's probably a good idea to go ahead and use one of your zip ties right here to keep your wires from interfering with triggering your Z in-stop. And now we can go ahead and insert our Bowden tube into the extruder side coupler right there. We'll make sure the Bowden tube is down in the hot end all the way. And we'll put our large collet clip on this side to make sure that tube stays put. and one of the smaller ones on this side. We'll also fix our bed leveling wheel. It just fell off during shipping. No worries, it goes right back on. Now this Ender 3 is a little bit different from the ones that I've seen. It actually comes with some binder clips and what seems to be a removable surface. This is usually just an adhesive sticker that goes on this aluminum bed, but this is kind of a nice addition. You can take it off if you want to remove the print. It is somewhat flexible. So we'll just put one of our clips at every corner and call that good. So the assembly is pretty much done, but we didn't tighten up a lot of the screws while we were putting it together. We left them somewhat loose, and that's because of this. Every one of these kits that I've ever seen was pretty unlevel out of the box. So we need to go around and try to straighten things up and get them as square as possible so the printer behaves correctly. We also need to tighten up some of the carriages to make sure that they're working optimally. So we'll do that now. There are two screws that attach the sides to the main channel of the printer. There's two on this side, two on the other side. First thing I'd like to do is loosen all four of these up. These two and these two over here. Loosen all four of those up about one turn each. Then make sure the printer's not setting on any wires or anything like that, and then force all four of the feet down as flush as you possibly can. It should level out, and then you can tighten those four screws back up. And that got rid of all the wobble out of the base. That should give us a much better foundation to square the rest of the machine. Next thing I want to do is make sure that there's no slop in the hot end carriage. You can see how it's dancing around right here? Well, this bottom wheel has an eccentric nut on it. That means it has an offset hole. So you can make this bottom wheel closer or further away from this extrusion. And that's how you tighten this up. So a view from the top, you can see how much slop is in there. This is that eccentric nut right down inside here. So you can take the wrench that they give you, and I like to just move around the carriage and give it about a quarter turn at a time until all the wobble out of the carriage is gone. And then when the wobble's gone, I usually give it just a little bit more, probably not even a quarter turn, to make sure it's super snug. You don't want these too tight because you'll start to see some wheel wear, but most of the time you shouldn't be able to move it at all. Same way with the X carriage. If there's slop left and right, this one seems to be pretty level. If you bring it all the way to the top, you should be able to kind of eyeball that. You can check it with a ruler if you like. Mine's about 54 millimeters on both sides, so it's pretty level. But if you need to adjust it, there are nuts for that. You have one on this wheel here and one on this wheel over here. That'll let you tighten how those wheels run on these extrusions and straighten it up a bit. This one seems to be good though. So while the X carriage is all the way at the top, I like to use this as my guide to square the frame up. So we'll leave it all the way up here, and I'm going to back these top four out just a bit. We're kind of letting the printer square itself, and then I'm going to snug all four of these up. And without a whole lot of effort, that should get you pretty square on the top of the gantry. Now we can go ahead and push the X down. This will let us know if that Z screw is going to bind. Mine's moving pretty smooth. That's good. We're going to take it all the way to the bottom, and then I'm going to flip it over. These four screws, when we installed them, we didn't snug them up yet, but now that the gantry's down, this should somewhat align these two extrusions that we attached, so they'll be somewhat square, and then we can snug these up. While you're under here, you might as well check these two in the center as well. You don't need to over tighten them, just make sure they're snug. And after that process, it's a pretty safe bet that your Z screw's relatively straight, because we could lift it and bring it all the way down without binding. So you can go ahead and tighten up your coupler. My recommendation is to make sure that your Z screw is setting on top of your motor shaft in that coupler. You can kind of see it through this split. If you set it on top of that shaft, that should make sure you don't have any unwanted expansion or compression inside that coupler. This isn't the spring type, so we should be okay. So we'll go ahead and tighten up these screws. Might as well tighten up the one on the motor shaft as well, just to make sure. Lift up to make sure there's no give. And you should be able to spin and lift the X real easy by hand. And you can. Next thing we'll look at is the bed adjustment, because most of the time you're always going to need to snug this up, because they usually come in looking like this. There's a whole lot of slop on that bed. But they have eccentric nuts on them, so you can make those wheels closer to the extrusion. So we'll flip it over on its side. I'm going to try to get you a good angle on this. but those are the two nuts that we're concerned about, those right there. Same process as the hot end carriage. I like to just turn them to the right until the bed gets a little bit more stable. We can adjust both. That feels a ton better. And then when it starts to get just a bit tight, I usually give it less than a quarter turn more, and it should be all set. After the bed's been straightened up a bit, go ahead and make sure this Y belt tension's okay. If it needs to be a little tighter, you can undo these screws right here and back it out a little bit. This one seems to be good. And now we need to level the bed a bit and set that Z end stop so we have the right clearance for the nozzle. I like to start with the bed tension somewhere in the middle. They usually come from the factory pretty loose, so I like to run these down until we're using up about half of the spring. About like that. I'll do that on all four corners. And then we can just push the X gantry down. The Z end stop is going to get triggered by this part right here. There, it's triggered. And if we look, we're nowhere near close to the bed with the nozzle. So we'll loosen up the Z end stop mount. And this end stop mount actually has a little foot as a guide. It sets on top of this extrusion. That's probably where they want you to mount this end stop. So let's just go ahead and give that a try. We'll put this little foot on top of there and we'll tighten it back up. Remember, make sure your T-nuts have spun the correct way and they're tightened up on that extrusion. You don't want this to move because you're going to get inconsistent level if it does. And then we'll just push our X gantry down until we trigger that end stop. Right there is about good. You can see we're still a little ways from the bed, but we have adjustments with these level knobs now. So we can adjust into the position we need to go to. So you can grab a Post-it or a business card, whatever you're comfortable with, to level it, just as kind of a feeler gauge. We'll just do rough on all four corners here. Remember, you're going to have the teeter-totter effect, especially when you're first setting a printer up. So you want to run around to all the corners before you make your final adjustments. And we've got it roughed in, but I want to do the final one after we hit auto home and we heat up the bed. Now we should be in a lot better shape for success now that we've squared things up a bit and everything seems to be moving freely. So let's go ahead and power up and get preheated, and we'll do our final level and then we'll run a test print. Powered on, we see the logo, fans are coming up, that's a good sign. The thermistors are reading 26C, that's also good. I'm pretty confident. Let's go ahead and go to auto home. Go to prepare, auto home. We have auto home successfully first time. I think we're going to be okay. From auto home, let's go down to preheat. We'll do preheat PLA. We'll just hit the top one, preheat PLA. We're going to set to 185 and 45 on the bed. Now that we're up to temp on the bed, be careful, but I'm going to go ahead and run around one more time and do a level. We'll have to turn the stepper motors off. Go to prepare, disable steppers. Now I'm much happier with that level. You can go ahead and clean off your build sheet with some alcohol if you have it. And to touch on this spool holder for a second, they give you this spool holder that's supposed to set up here and feed your filament down into the extruder in kind of a U. I recommend not using this holder at all. If you do feed your extruder from the top, it's going to wear a keyhole right here where it feeds it into this plastic extruder arm. Eventually, that's going to start catching the filament and it'll lead to missteps on the extruder because it can't pull it through cleanly. I highly recommend you get a different spool holder and feed this in from the side as level as possible with the X gantry. One last check before we load our filament. It's a good idea to check this arm, make sure it's not bound up, and your idler is spinning freely. You need to adjust it if it doesn't. Also, your extruder gear, make sure that your grub screws are on the flat part of the motor shaft, and both of those are tight. You can just check those with your smallest wrench, and these seem to be good to go. We'll load our filament. We'll cut the tip at an angle with the cutters that Creality gave us with this kit. We'll straighten it up a bit. We'll feed it through the extruder arm into the idler gear. Since we're preheated, we can go ahead and keep loading all the way down to the hot end. And we're ready to print. All we need is some G-code. We'll use the SD card that came with the kit. I'm sure there's some sample G-code on there that you could run. I'm going to load my own. Let's load up the Benchy. I already have an Ender 3 config, but the biggest thing to set on an Ender 3 is usually retraction length. I set mine around 6, The speed really doesn't matter so much because internally in the firmware it's automatically set to 25 feed rate. I'll leave a link to my G-code so you can get the values that I use. So we'll slice and we'll export to our SD card. We'll load our SD card right here. And from the LCD, we'll init TF card. We'll print from TF. We'll grab our Benchy. And we'll start printing. Auto home looks good. My prime line looks good. First layer looks like it's going to be successful. Let's let it print and see what kind of results we get. And there it is, worked first time, no issues at all. First print, completely successful. I have to say, that's not a bad looking Benchy, especially since we didn't do any tuning. So there it is, the Creality Ender 3 has been assembled and it's printing successfully. Right now we have a total of $153 US and some change, but we'll keep track of that as we go forward. There are so many different tweaks that you could make to this printer, but on this one I wanted to go completely unmodified. This is what you're going to get out of the box for a sub $200 3D printer. And I have to say, from what I've seen so far, it looks pretty promising. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribe to my channel. If not, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.